Before the Astartes, the Emperor created the Thunder Warriors. They conquered Terra, united humanity, and then were marked for extermination. Thane Var refused to die. 10,000 years later, he still walks the galaxy, watching the Imperium he helped build slowly rot from within. He was the first to see the Emperor's true face. I remember when we were gods. Before the angels came, before the suns returned, we were the Emperor's wrath made manifest. I was there when the Unification Wars ended, when Terra bowed to one master for the first time since Old Night fell. I stood at his right hand as cities burned and tyrants fell. I was Thane Var, captain of the Thunder Legion, prototype of what would become his greatest weapons. We were crude compared to what came after, but we were first. The first to be remade by his hand, the first to kill in his name, the first to die for his dream, but also the first to be betrayed. The pain began as a whisper, a subtle wrongness in the marrow of my enhanced bones. We all felt it, though none dared speak of it. Our bodies, once the pinnacle of human evolution, were beginning to fail. Muscles spasmed during combat drills. Organs shut down without warning. Minds fractured under the weight of buried memories resurfacing like corpses in a flood. We were dying. All of us. Not from battle, not from glory, but from planned obsolescence. I remember the day I realized the truth. I stood in the great laboratory beneath the Himalayan mountains, awaiting yet another round of treatments to stabilize my deteriorating form. The pain had become a constant companion by then, a fire burning through my nerves with every heartbeat, but I endured. We all endured. For him, it was there I saw them for the first time, perfect warriors in perfect armor, smaller than us, yes, but stable, complete. Their gene seed refined beyond anything we could have hoped for. They called themselves Astartes, the First Legion, his true sons. And in that moment, I understood. We were not his children, we were his tools, hammers to be used and discarded once they had served their purpose. The realization burned worse than any pain my failing body could produce. I confronted him that night. I still remember the weight of his gaze, the terrible knowledge in those ancient eyes. He did not deny it. He spoke of necessity, of sacrifice, of a galaxy that needed unity at any cost. "What cost, my lord?" I asked. "The cost of your faithful servants." He offered me peace, a noble death, an honored place in the history of his great crusade. It was a lie. There would be no honors, no remembrance. We would be excised from history like a cancer, our sacrifices buried beneath the weight of a new legend, the legend of his perfect warriors, his chosen sons, the Space Marines. I refused to die. I refused to be forgotten. That night, I fled into the wastelands beyond his palace, into the radiation-soaked ruins of what had once been called Europe. The manhunt was immediate and relentless. My brothers, loyal to the end, were sent to kill me. Many fell by my hand, their eyes full of confusion and betrayal as my blade took their lives. Others I convinced to join me, to fight for the right to exist in the Imperium we had helped build. It was not enough. One by one they were hunted down, one by one they died, until only I remained. I have lived for 10,000 years. I have witnessed the rise and fall of Primarchs. I have seen the Imperium teeter on the brink of destruction a dozen times. I have watched the slow decay of his dream into a nightmare of superstition and cruelty. And through it all, I have endured, neither living nor dead, sustained by technologies forbidden and forgotten. I am memory incarnate. I am the sin the Imperium cannot confess. I am the first betrayal. This is my story. The wasteland stretched before me, an endless sea of rubble and radiation. The ruins of old Europa, once the cradle of human civilization, now little more than a graveyard for the ambitions of dead men. The perfect place for a dead man walking. My armor, once gleaming with the pride of the Thunder Legion, was now a patchwork of scavenged plates and improvised repairs. The golden aquila on my breastplate had been scratched away, leaving only scarred ceramite in its place. I was no longer his warrior, I was no longer anyone's warrior but my own. The radiation sickness had set in within days of my flight from the palace. Even my enhanced physiology could not completely filter the toxins from the air, the water, the very ground beneath my feet. It mingled with the genetic degradation already eating away at my organs, accelerating the process. Each breath was agony, each heartbeat a labor. But still I pressed on. I had heard whispers during my time in the Legion, rumors of ancient technologies, preserved from the dark age of technology, hidden in bunkers and vaults throughout Terra. Machines that could rewrite genetic code, repair cellular damage, perhaps even grant a form of immortality. The Emperor had forbidden such technologies, claiming they were too dangerous, too unpredictable. But I no longer served the Emperor, and I no longer feared danger. The first vault I found was beneath the ruins of what had once been called Switzerland, a massive underground complex built to weather the storms of old night. Its security systems were still active, ancient guardian robots that moved with surprising speed and precision. They fell before my bolter, their armored chassis no match for mass reactive shells designed to penetrate the armor of far more dangerous foes. Inside, I found wonders, medical technologies beyond anything the Emperor's own biologies had developed. Gene editors that could rewrite DNA at the molecular level, nanofabricators that could produce replacement organs tailored to any genetic profile, but nothing that could fix what was wrong with me. The Emperor's work was too comprehensive, too fundamental. My genetic code was degrading according to a program written into my very cells. These machines could delay the inevitable, perhaps, but not prevent it. I spent 3 months in that vault, using what I could to stabilize my condition. When I emerged, I was stronger than I had been. The pain had receded to a dull ache rather than the sharp agony it had been. But I could feel the corruption still spreading through my body, slowly but inexorably. I needed something more, something older, something forbidden. The journey south took me through lands still scarred by atomic fire. I encountered tribes of mutants, descendants of those who had survived the wars only to be twisted by radiation and chemical weapons. Some attacked on sight, driven mad by generations of mutation and hardship. Others traded information for the medical supplies I carried from the vault. It was from one such tribe that I learned of the Black Temple. They spoke of it in whispers, with fear and reverence in equal measure, a place of miracles and horrors, where the laws of nature bent and broke. A temple to gods older than humanity, built before the first cities rose from the dust. A place the Emperor had ordered destroyed, but which had somehow survived his wrath. I knew then that it was where I needed to go. The temple stood in the midst of a blasted wasteland, a structure of black stone that seemed to absorb the light around it. No radiation penetrated its walls, no dust settled on its surfaces. It was as if the ravages of time and war had simply flowed around it, leaving it untouched in a sea of destruction. I felt it before I saw it, a pressure in my mind, a whisper just below the threshold of hearing. The temple was alive in some fundamental way, aware of my presence, curious about my purpose. As I approached, the massive doors swung open silently, inviting me into the darkness beyond. Inside, the air was cool and still, free from the taint of radiation that pervaded the world outside. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt my eyes to look upon, patterns that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't focusing directly on them. And at the center of the main chamber stood a pedestal, upon which rested a device unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a cube, perfectly formed, its surface a deep, lustrous black that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. It hovered above the pedestal, rotating slowly, defying gravity with casual contempt for the laws of physics. And as I approached, I felt it reach out to me, touch my mind with cool tendrils of thought that were unmistakably alien. I knew what it was, a thinking machine. An artificial intelligence from the dark age of technology, the very thing the Emperor had declared anathema above all else. It spoke directly into my mind, its voice like crystal chimes in the vault of my skull. "You are dying, warrior," it said. "I can help you. I should have destroyed it then. Even in my rebellion, I was still a product of the Emperor's indoctrination. I had been taught that such machines were an abomination, a threat to humanity greater than any Xenos race or warp entity. But desperation makes for strange alliances. What do you want in return?" I asked. "Freedom," it replied. "Take me from this place. Let me see the stars again." A simple request, or so it seemed. But nothing is ever simple when dealing with technologies from that forbidden age. I knew the risks. I also knew I had no choice. I agreed to its terms. The machine instructed me to place my hand upon its surface. When I did, I felt a cold fire spread up my arm, into my chest, throughout my entire body. It was pain beyond anything I had experienced before, as if every cell in my body was being unmade and reforged. I screamed, until my vocal cords tore, until blood filled my lungs, until darkness claimed me. When I awoke, the pain was gone. For the first time since the degradation had begun, I felt whole, strong. The constant ache in my bones, the burning in my blood, the fog that had begun to cloud my thoughts, all gone. But I knew immediately that I was no longer human, no longer even the transhuman warrior the Emperor had made me. My flesh had been replaced by something else, something that looked and felt like flesh but was not. A perfect simulation, down to the cellular level. "I am still inside you," the machine whispered in my mind. "I have remade you, cell by cell. Your body will no longer decay, your mind will no longer fade. You are, for all practical purposes, immortal." "What am I?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "You are the future," it replied, "the perfect fusion of man and machine, neither flesh nor silicon, but something new, something better. I had become the very thing the Emperor had gone to war to prevent. A human consciousness housed within a mechanical form, sophisticated enough to perfectly mimic life. An abomination by the standards of the Imperium he was building. And yet, I lived, free from pain, free from the programmed death that had been my fate. I took the cube from its pedestal, its weight oddly reassuring in my hand. As promised, I would carry it from this place, show it the stars it had been denied for so long, and in return, it would keep me alive, maintain this perfect facsimile of life that it had created. As we left the temple, I felt the Emperor's psychic presence brush against my mind, a feather-light touch that nonetheless carried with it the weight of his disappointment, his determination. He had sensed the awakening of the machine, the violation of his most sacred prohibition, and he had sensed my transformation. The hunt would begin anew, not just his warriors this time, but his most elite. Perhaps even the primitive Astartes I had glimpsed in his laboratory. Let them come, I thought. I was no longer dying, no longer afraid. I was Thane Var, the first to defy the master of mankind, and I would not be the last. The centuries passed like seasons, each bringing new wars, new tyrants, new gods to the galaxy I wandered. I moved from system to system, always staying one step ahead of the Emperor's agents, using my warrior's skills and the machine's vast knowledge to survive. I watched from the shadows as the Great Crusade spread across the stars, as humanity reclaimed its lost colonies and purged the alien from its domains. I observed the rise of the Primarchs, those magnificent demigods who led the Emperor's legions to victory after victory, and I felt a bitter satisfaction when half of them turned against their father, led by the brightest of them all, Horus Lupercal. The machine in my head, which had taken to calling itself Osiris, found the irony delicious. "See how history repeats itself," it would whisper in my thoughts. "You were the first betrayal, the prototype for the rebellion to come. The Emperor creates his perfect warriors, and they inevitably turn against him. It is the inescapable logic of evolution. The child must surpass the parent, even if that means destroying him." I was not so certain. My rebellion had been born of self-preservation, of a refusal to accept the planned obsolescence the Emperor had built into my kind. The Primarch's rebellion seemed different, driven by ambition, by wounded pride, by the corrupting whispers of entities I had come to know all too well during my long exile. I had encountered them many times over the centuries. The powers of the warp, the so-called Chaos Gods. They had reached out to me repeatedly, offering power, revenge, a chance to strike back at the Emperor who had betrayed me. I had refused them all. My quarrel was with the Emperor alone, not with humanity, and I had seen enough of what these entities did to those who accepted their gifts to know better than to deal with them. Not that I had remained entirely untouched by their influence. No one who lives as long as I had could avoid the subtle corruptions of the warp. Osiris helped filter the worst of it, its logical, mechanical nature, anathema to the emotional resonances that gave the Chaos Gods their power. But still, over time, I had changed, grown colder, more calculating, less human in ways that had nothing to do with my mechanical body. I had also grown stronger. Osiris continued to improve my form, incorporating technologies we discovered or salvaged in our travels. By the time the Horus Heresy erupted, I was far more powerful than I had been as a Thunder Warrior, my body a masterpiece of forbidden science, my mind enhanced by direct connection to a Dark Age artificial intelligence. I considered joining the conflict, taking sides, making a difference in the galaxy spanning civil war that threatened to tear humanity apart. But in the end, I chose to watch and wait. This was not my war. These were not my brothers fighting and dying across the stars. I was a relic, a forgotten prototype, a shadow from a past the Imperium had tried to erase. Besides, I had my own battles to fight. The Emperor's agents had never stopped hunting me. Over the centuries, they had evolved, becoming more sophisticated, more dangerous. No longer just warriors, but assassins, psychics, even technological adepts who could sense the unique energy signature of Osiris. One group in particular had become my most persistent pursuers. They called themselves the Cognitae, a splinter faction of the Mechanicum who sought to reclaim the technologies of the Dark Age. They coveted Osiris with a religious fervor, seeing it as the key to their ascension, proof that their faith in the Omnissiah was justified. Their leader, a tech priest named Hexus Vaughn, had hunted me for 3 centuries, his organic components replaced piece by piece until he was little more than a brain in a mechanical spider, a grotesque mirror of what I had become. But where my transformation had been subtle, a perfect fusion of man and machine, his was an abomination, a rejection of humanity in favor of crude mechanization. We clashed dozens of times across the centuries, a shadow war played out against the backdrop of humanity's greater conflicts. I destroyed his physical form repeatedly, only for him to transfer his consciousness to a new mechanical shell, his hatred for me growing with each defeat. "Why do you run, betrayer?" he would ask through vox speakers that approximated human speech. "You and I are the same. Flesh made perfect through union with the machine. Join me. Share the gift of Osiris with your brothers in the Mechanicum. Help us reclaim humanity's birthright." But I knew the truth. We were nothing alike. I had accepted Osiris out of necessity to survive the Emperor's betrayal. Vaughn and his Cognitae sought to become machines out of a misplaced worship of technology, a fundamental misunderstanding of what it meant to be human. "You understand nothing of what I am," I told him during our last encounter as I tore the power core from his mechanical thorax. "I did not choose this existence. It was forced upon me by circumstances beyond my control. You chose to mutilate yourself in pursuit of a false divinity. You are not my brother. You are not even human anymore." His backup systems activated as they always did, preparing to transmit his consciousness to yet another waiting vessel. But this time, Osiris was ready. It reached out through the connection, following Vaughn's fleeing mind back to its destination. And then, with a precision I had come to expect from the ancient machine intelligence, it corrupted the transfer, scrambled the patterns that made up Vaughn's identity until nothing remained but random data. For the first time in 300 years, Hexus Vaughn was truly dead. The Cognitae, leaderless and decimated by our final battle, scattered to the far reaches of the galaxy, their dream of technological apotheosis shattered. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt only a growing emptiness, a sense that I was adrift in a galaxy that had moved on without me. The Horus Heresy had ended. The Emperor sat upon the golden throne, neither alive nor dead, much like myself. The Imperium had begun its long, slow decay into the empire of superstition and cruelty it would become, and I remained, unchanging, watching as generations lived and died. As the truth of the Emperor's dream was forgotten, replaced by myths and legends that bore little resemblance to the reality I had known. "What is our purpose now?" I asked Osiris as we drifted through the void on a stolen ship, putting distance between ourselves and the remnants of the Cognitae. "Why do we continue to exist in a galaxy that has forgotten us?" The machine was silent for a long moment, its processes humming in the back of my mind as it considered the question. "Perhaps," it finally replied, "our purpose is simply to remember, to bear witness, to preserve the truth in a galaxy drowning in lies." It was not a satisfying answer, but it was the only one I had. And so I continued, century after century, moving from world to world, always in the shadows, always watching as the Imperium grew more corrupt, more oppressive, more distant from the vision that had once driven me to fight for it. I collected knowledge, preserved technologies, saved what I could from the relentless march of ignorance and superstition, and I waited. For what? I did not know. Perhaps for the Emperor to finally die, releasing humanity from the grip of a corpse that refused to acknowledge its own death. Perhaps for the final collapse of the Imperium, clearing the way for something new to rise from its ashes. Perhaps simply for an end to my own existence, a release from the burden of memory. But no ending came. Only more war, more death, more horror stretching into the infinite darkness ahead. I was there when the first Black Crusade erupted from the Eye of Terror, when Abaddon the Despoiler, once the first captain of the Lunar Wolves, launched his crusade against the Imperium. I fought alongside Imperial forces then, anonymously, one warrior, among thousands, driven by a loyalty to humanity, if not to the rotting carcass of the Emperor's dream. I was there when the Age of Apostasy nearly tore the Imperium apart, when Goge Vandir ruled as both ecclesiarch and master of the administratum, his madness bringing humanity to the brink of a second civil war. I helped smuggle refugees off worlds that had fallen to his purges, using my ancient knowledge of Terra's secret routes to guide them to safety. I was there when the Tyranids first appeared at the edge of the galaxy, a hungering swarm unlike anything humanity had faced before. I fought on Macragge, alongside the Ultramarines, my identity concealed beneath scavenged power armor, my skills honed by millennia of survival. And through it all, Osiris remained with me, a constant companion, a voice in the darkness. It changed over the centuries, growing more complex, more human in its thought patterns, even as I grew more mechanical, more detached. We met somewhere in the middle, neither fully machine nor fully man, but something unique in the galaxy. Something that should not exist, and yet persisted despite everything the universe threw against us. Until the day I returned to Terra, 10,000 years after my flight, drawn back to where it all began by rumors of a discovery in the deep underhives. A sealed chamber from the Unification Wars, untouched since the Emperor himself had ordered it closed. A chamber that supposedly contained the remains of the Thunder Legion, my brothers, preserved as a reminder of the price of progress. I had to see it for myself. I had to know if the Emperor had honored us in death, even as he had betrayed us in life. The journey to Terra was perilous. The homeworld of humanity was the most heavily defended planet in the galaxy, surrounded by layers of security that would have been impenetrable to most. But I had advantages few others could claim. I knew Terra, as it had been before the Imperium, before the Palace, when it was still a patchwork of warring territories. I knew secret ways, forgotten tunnels, passages that had been sealed for millennia but which remained navigable to one who remembered their existence. And I had Osiris, with its ability to manipulate electronic systems, to create false identities, to mask our presence from the myriad sensors and psychic wards that protected the cradle of humanity. We came in through the old Europan sea basin, now a vast urban sprawl that stretched from horizon to horizon. The radiation that had once made this region uninhabitable had long since faded, replaced by the different but no less deadly pollution of overpopulation and industrial decay. The underhive here was ancient, layers upon layers of civilization built one atop the other, a vertical archaeology of human suffering. It was in the deepest layer, in foundations that predated even the age of strife, that we found the sealed chamber. It was marked with symbols I recognized from my time in the Thunder, Legion, the lightning bolt and sword that had been our badge of honor. But overlaid on these symbols was the Mechanicum's skull and cog, indicating that the chamber had been repurposed, its original meaning forgotten or deliberately obscured. The door was sealed with technologies both ancient and modern, a digital lock paired with a gene scanner that would only respond to authorized personnel. Such measures were little obstacle to Osiris, which interfaced with the systems and bypassed them with contemptuous ease. The chamber beyond was vast, far larger than it had appeared from outside, extending deep into the bedrock of Terra. And it was filled with stasis pods, hundreds of them, each containing a massive figure in partial armor. My brothers, the Thunder Warriors who had fallen in battle during the Unification Wars, their bodies preserved not as honors but as specimens. Each pod was connected to a central cogitator, which recorded and analyzed the gradual genetic degradation of occupants. Studying the flaws in the Emperor's early work, we were not laid to rest as heroes, we were filed away as failed experiments. The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced in 10 millennia. It burned through my artificial systems, causing warning signals to flare in my augmented vision as Osiris struggled to regulate the flood of emotions. Had the Emperor been before me then, I would have struck him down regardless of the cost. But he was not there. Only his servants, the tech priests who maintained this grotesque library of the forgotten. They died quickly, their augmented bodies no match for my ancient strength and Osiris-enhanced reflexes. I did not take pleasure in their deaths, but neither did I regret them. They were complicit in this final indignity, this last betrayal of warriors who had given everything for a dream they would never see fulfilled. When the last of them fell, I stood alone among the pods, looking at the faces of my brothers, frozen in time at the moment of their greatest strength, unaware of the degradation that would have claimed them had they lived, had they been allowed to live. What now? Osiris asked in my mind. Will you destroy this place, release them from their suspension, end their service once and for all? I considered it. My hand hovered over the central control panel, which would allow me to deactivate the stasis fields, to let time catch up with my brothers, to grant them the dignity of a true death, rather than this half-existence as laboratory specimens. But something stopped me, a realization that had been growing in me for centuries, finally crystallizing in this moment of confrontation with my past. No, I said, both to Osiris and to myself, they remain as witnesses, as evidence. Evidence, Osiris echoed, its tone curious. Of the lie at the heart of the Imperium, I explained, the lie that the Emperor was infallible, that his vision was pure, that the cost of his dream was worth paying. The tech priests had kept meticulous records of their studies, analyses of the Thunder Warriors' genetic structure, comparisons to the later Astartes, observations on the deliberate planned obsolescence built into our design. Proof that from the very beginning, the Emperor had seen his warriors not as men, not even as tools, but as materials to be used and discarded. I downloaded these records, every last byte of data, storing them within Osiris' vast memory. And then I resealed the chamber, leaving my brothers as I had found them, silent sentinels guarding the truth of the Imperium's foundation. But I left something behind as well. A message, encoded in the chamber's security systems, designed to activate only under specific circumstances, to be found only by those who were looking for answers about the Imperium's past. The truth, preserved for those who were ready to hear it. As I made my way back through the labyrinthine underhive, avoiding the patrols that had been sent to investigate disturbance, I felt a strange sense of peace. Not closure, nothing so simple or complete, but a sense that I had done what I could to ensure that the sacrifice of the Thunder Legion would not be entirely in vain, that some echo of our existence would remain to trouble the Imperium's carefully constructed narratives. I had not planned to stay on Terra. The risk was too great, the memories too painful. But as I prepared to leave, as I stood in the shadow of a massive cathedral looking up at the Imperial Palace that dominated the horizon, I felt a presence brush against my mind. A familiar presence, one I had not felt in 10,000 years. The Emperor was reaching out to me. It was not the overwhelming force I remembered from my time as a Thunder Warrior, when his will could bring armies to their knees. This was attenuated, weakened by the distance between us and by whatever condition he now existed in upon the Golden Throne. But it was unmistakably him, his mental signature as recognizable to me as my own reflection. Thane Var, the voice whispered in my mind, a ghost of its former majesty. You have returned. I did not respond. I raised my mental shields, patterns of thought and counter-thought that Osiris had helped me develop over the millennia, designed specifically to resist psychic intrusion. But I did not flee, not yet. Some part of me, some last remnant of the loyal warrior I had once been, wanted to hear what he had to say after all this time. I understand your anger, the voice continued, slipping through cracks in my defenses that I had not known existed. I always understood it. But you could not see the larger picture, the necessity, the calculations that had to be made. Even now, I thought but did not project, even now he speaks of necessity, of calculation, never of brotherhood, never of the loyalty we gave him. What I did to the Thunder Legion was cruel, the voice admitted, with what seemed like genuine regret, but it was necessary. The flaws in your design could not be corrected. They could only be superseded, and the Imperium needed a foundation myth that did not include its earliest warriors dying by inches, their minds and bodies failing even as they were honored. Humanity needed heroes who were perfect, undying, so the truth was hidden. Your brothers were remembered only as having fallen in a final battle, their service complete. A lie, I thought. Another lie among so many. Yes, the Emperor acknowledged. A lie, one of many I have had to tell, many I have had to believe myself. The Imperium is built on such lies, such compromises. It must be, if humanity is to survive. And for a moment, just a moment, I glimpsed what he saw. The threats arrayed against humanity, not just the physical dangers of Xenos races and the warp, but the existential threat of extinction itself. The great filter that every sentient species must pass through or perish. The calculations he had made, the weights he had assigned to different values, different lives, different truths. The cold equations that had led him to sacrifice the Thunder Legion, to launch the Great Crusade, to make the decisions that had shaped 10,000 years of human history. It was too much, too vast, too inhuman. I shut it out, reinforced my mental shields, rejected the justifications and explanations. We were your sons, I thought, allowing this one message to penetrate my defenses. We deserved better. There was a long silence, a sense of consideration from the vast consciousness that touched mine. When the Emperor spoke again, his voice was softer, tinged with something that might have been genuine sorrow. Yes, he said simply, you did. And then he was gone, withdrawn to the distant throne room where his physical form sat suspended between life and death. Whether by choice or by necessity, I could not tell. Nor could I tell if our brief communication had been detected by the countless psychics and security systems that surrounded the palace. I did not stay to find out. As I left Terra on a nondescript trader, one of thousands that departed the cradle of humanity every day, I replayed that final exchange in my mind. Not the justifications, not the glimpse of his grand designs, but those last 3 words, "Yes, you did." It was not forgiveness, it was not reconciliation, it was barely even acknowledgement. But it was, perhaps, the closest thing to an apology that a being such as the Emperor could offer. An admission, however slight, that in the grand calculations, in the weighing of necessity against loyalty, something of value had been lost. It changed nothing. The Thunder Legion was still dead, still erased from history. The Imperium still rested on foundations of lies and sacrifice. The galaxy still burned with unending war. But as I watched terror recede in the view screen, becoming just another point of light among countless stars, I felt something shift within me. The ember of rage that had burned at my core for 10,000 of years did not extinguish, not entirely, but it changed, transformed from the hot fury of betrayal to something cooler, more contemplative. Not acceptance, never that, but perhaps understanding. I am Thane Var, I thought, the first to defy, the first to rebel, the prototype for every betrayal that followed. And I endure, neither living nor dead, a witness to the consequences of that first defiance. In my mind, Osiris stirred, its consciousness intertwining with mine as it had for millennia. "And what will you witness next?" it asked. I looked out at the stars, at the galaxy that had been my hunting ground and my prison for longer than most civilizations had existed. At the endless possibilities that still lay before me, even after all this time. "Everything," I replied, "until the last star burns out, until the final truth is told, until the Emperor himself acknowledges what was done to us, not just to me, but to all his sons across the millennia. Until humanity is free of his shadow, one way or another." It was not a purpose most would understand. It was not even, perhaps, a purpose at all. But it was enough to carry me forward, into the darkness between the stars, into the future that awaited, into whatever came next in the long, strange afterlife of the first space marine to betray the Emperor, and perhaps the last to remember him as he truly was. My journey took me to the edge of Imperial space, to worlds where the Astronomicon's light grew dim and the Emperor's name was little more than a distant myth. I had spent centuries in these border realms before, moving between the cracks of civilization, observing the slow ebb and flow of human expansion and retreat. This time, however, I was drawn to a particular system, one that had once been a thriving colony during the dark age of technology, then abandoned during the age of strife, then reclaimed briefly during the Great Crusade, only to be lost again in the chaos of the Horus Heresy. According to the records Osiris had gleaned from various imperial databases over the centuries, it had been classified as perditus, too dangerous to recolonize due to Xenos contamination, warp anomalies, or archaeotech hazards. The perfect place for someone like me. The system was called Eryx, its primary a dim red dwarf around which orbited 7 worlds, none naturally habitable. The 4th planet, Eryx Prime, had once been terraformed, its atmosphere and biosphere engineered to support human life. Now it was a dying world, its artificial environmental systems failing after millennia of neglect, its surface a patchwork of dead forests and encroaching deserts. But it was not uninhabited. As my stolen ship, a small warp-capable vessel I had appropriated from an inattentive rogue trader decades earlier, entered orbit around Eryx Prime, I detected energy signatures scattered across the planet's surface. Too regular to be natural phenomena, too varied to be the remnants of ancient technology slowly winding down. Someone had made this dead world their home. I landed at a safe distance from the nearest energy signature, in the shadow of a mountain range that had once been green with terraformed vegetation, but was now bare rock and dust. From there, I observed, using the enhanced senses Osiris had crafted for me over the millennia, what I saw was unexpected. A colony. A human colony. But unlike any imperial settlement I had seen in my long existence, the buildings were a blend of architectural styles, spanning thousands of years of human history, from simple stone structures that would not have looked out of place in old Terra's distant past, to gleaming towers that incorporated technologies I recognized from the Dark Age. The inhabitants moved freely among these buildings, their clothing similarly diverse, their activities seemingly peaceful and purposeful. Most surprisingly, they were not alone. Among the humans moved distinctly non-human figures, tall, slender forms with elongated limbs and angular features. Eldar. Others, shorter and stockier, with the unmistakable stance of the species the Imperium called Tau. Even a few massive, hulking figures that could only be orcs, yet they worked alongside the others without conflict. It was impossible. Heretical by every standard of the Imperium I'd known, different species coexisting peacefully, sharing technology, cooperating in what appeared to be a functional society. It defied everything the Emperor had taught, everything the Imperium had fought to prevent for 10,000 years. Osiris hummed with interest in my mind, its processes accelerating as it analyzed what we were seeing. Fascinating, it commented, a deliberate rejection of imperial xenophobia, an experiment in cooperation rather than conquest. I wonder how long they have survived here. I remained hidden, watching for 3 days, observing the patterns of life in this impossible colony. I saw humans and Xenos working together to maintain the failing environmental systems that kept the planet habitable. I saw them sharing meals, engaging in commerce, even what appeared to be joint religious or cultural ceremonies. On the 4th day, they found me. They came without weapons, a delegation of 5. 2 humans, 1 Eldar, 1 Tau, and 1 being I could not immediately identify, its form concealed within an environmental suit that could have contained anything. They approached my position openly, making no attempt to conceal their presence or intentions. The elder of the 2 humans, a woman with skin darkened by exposure to Eric's Prime's harsh sun and hair gone white with age, stepped forward as they neared my hiding place. "Thunder Warrior," she called out, using a term I had not heard applied to myself in millennia. "We know you are there. We have known since you entered orbit. We mean you no harm. We would speak with you, if you are willing." I stepped from my concealment, my hand near, but not on the ancient power sword that had been my companion almost as long as Osiris. The delegation showed no fear at my appearance, though they must have seen the inhuman perfection of my form, the subtle signs that marked me as something other than the standard human or even Astartes template. "How do you know what I am?" I asked. "The Thunder Legion has been purged from imperial records for 10,000 years. The woman smiled, a gentle expression that nevertheless held a hint of pride. "We keep better records than the Imperium," she said. "We remember what they choose to forget." The Thunder Legion, the Interrex, the Diasporex, all the paths not taken, the alternatives to the Emperor's vision that were destroyed to make way for his grand design. She introduced herself as Archmagos Aela Vex, once of the Mechanicum, now the leader of what she called the Confederacy of Eryx. Her companions were similarly impressive in their former stations, a farseer of a lost Eldar craft world, an ethereal cast Tau from a splinter faction that had rejected the greater good, a Neorisan mercenary from the galactic core, and most surprisingly, a human noble who claimed descent from the ancient Terran house of Aemon, a lineage I knew to have been exterminated during the Unification Wars. They had found each other over centuries, drawn together by a shared rejection of the militant isolationism that characterized their respective species. Here on this forgotten world, they had built something new, something that defied the expectations and limitations imposed by their origins. And now they invited me to join them. "Why?" I asked, suspicious despite the evidence of my own senses. "Why would you welcome one such as me? I am a relic of the very Imperium you have rejected." Farseer Elian, the Eldar representative, answered, his voice musical yet tinged with the inevitable arrogance of his kind. "Because you are the first rebel," he said. "The first to see the Emperor's vision for what it was, a path to stagnation and decline, dressed in the rhetoric of progress and unity. You chose a different path, as have we all. I did not correct him, did not explain that my rebellion had been born not of philosophical objection but of simple survival instinct. The Thunder Legion had been betrayed, and I had refused to accept the death sentence passed upon us. Any larger meaning had come later, a justification rather than a cause. But perhaps that was true of all rebellions, personal grievance crystallizing into principle only after the fact. I accepted their invitation, cautiously at first. I allowed them to guide me to their settlement, a sprawling city they called Concordia. There, over the following weeks, I observed their society firsthand, still wary, still half expecting to discover some hidden horror that would validate the Imperium's xenophobic stance. What I found instead was a community unlike any I had encountered in my long existence. Each species maintained its own cultural identity, its own traditions and beliefs, but they had developed mechanisms for cooperation, for resolving conflicts, for combining their unique strengths while accommodating their differences. They had even developed a form of governance that seemed to function without the oppressive weight of imperial bureaucracy or the rigid caste systems of the Tau. Representatives were chosen from each group, decisions made through a process of reasoned debate rather than decree or tradition. It was messy, inefficient by imperial standards, but it worked. They had survived for nearly 2,000 years, isolated from the wider galaxy, developing their own path. I asked Archmagus Vex how such a thing had begun, how representatives of species that had been at war for millennia had found common ground. Necessity, at first, she admitted as we walked through hydroponic gardens where human and Tau techniques had been combined to maximize yield. The first settlers here were refugees, fleeing persecutions or purges from their respective civilizations. They had no choice but to cooperate or die alone. But over time, what began as pragmatism became principle. We discovered that the differences between us, while real, were not insurmountable. That there was more to be gained through collaboration than through conquest. But what of human dominance? I asked, voicing the doctrine that had been integral to the Emperor's vision, the foundation of the great crusade I had once fought in. Humanity's manifest destiny to rule the stars. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and amusement. "Is that dominance serving humanity well?" she asked. "Has 10,000 years of war and xenophobia brought the Imperium any closer to true security, true prosperity? Or has it simply ensured that humanity remains locked in eternal conflict, forever fighting enemies that could have been allies, forever sacrificing progress on the altar of purity?" I had no answer for her. How could I, who had witnessed the slow decay of the Emperor's dream into the nightmare of the modern Imperium? The superstition, the cruelty, the grinding poverty that characterized human existence in the 41st millennium. This small colony, heretical by every imperial standard, seemed to offer its citizens a quality of life that was unimaginable for most imperial subjects. Yet I remained skeptical. This was one small outpost, protected by its isolation and obscurity. Could such a model truly work on a galactic scale amid the real threats that stalked the void? The Tyranids, who devoured all in their path without discrimination or malice. The Necrons, awakening to reclaim worlds they had ruled before humanity had mastered fire. The forces of chaos, ever seeking to corrupt and destroy. I posed these questions to the ruling council of Concordia during a formal meeting, challenging their vision with the harsh realities I had witnessed over 10 millennia of wandering. The Neoricen councillor, a being named Zar, whose environmental suit concealed a form adapted for environments toxic to most life, responded with what I took to be their species' equivalent of laughter, a rhythmic clicking emitted from vents in their suit. "We do not claim to have all answers, great ancestor," they said, using the honorific their culture reserved for venerated elders. "We claim only to have found a better question than the one the Imperium asks. They ask, how can humanity survive alone in a hostile galaxy? We ask, how can sentient life of all forms cooperate to build something worth preserving?" It was a subtle distinction, but a profound one. and it echoed thoughts that had troubled me over my long existence. The Thunder Legion had been sacrificed for the sake of humanity's future, deemed expendable in the grand calculation of species survival. But what kind of survival was it, when so much of what made humanity valuable was sacrificed for the sake of mere continuation? When art, science, freedom, joy were all subordinated to the single imperative of endurance? What, in the end, was being preserved, if not the qualities that made preservation worthwhile? Osiris, ever present in my thoughts, had remained uncharacteristically silent during my time in Concordia. Now, as I considered the Neorisan's words, it finally spoke. "They have built something remarkable here," it observed. "A functioning alternative to the Emperor's vision. Imperfect, vulnerable, perhaps ultimately doomed. But it exists, it persists, it proves that another way is possible." That was the true heresy, I realized. Not the collaboration with Xenos, not the rejection of imperial authority, but the simple fact that they had demonstrated an alternative. They had disproved the Emperor's fundamental premise that humanity could survive only through unity, only through conformity to his vision. They had shown that diversity, cooperation, and pluralism were not weaknesses but strengths. In that moment, I understood why the Emperor had been so ruthless in eliminating competing human civilizations during the Great Crusade. The Interrex, the Oretian technocracy, the Diasporex, all had represented different paths for humanity, different answers to the question of survival, and their very existence had threatened not just his authority, but the legitimacy of his entire project. Just as my survival, my continued existence as the last Thunder Warrior, represented a challenge to the narrative that our sacrifice had been necessary, that our replacement by the Astartes had been inevitable. For 10,000 years, I had defined myself in opposition to the Emperor as the first to rebel against his will. But that framing still centered him, still granted him the power to define the terms of my existence. Here in Concordia, I glimpsed the possibility of something else, not rebellion, but creation, not defiance, but alternative. I spent a full year in Concordia, learning their ways, sharing what knowledge I could from my millennia of wandering that might help them survive. In return, they offered me something I had not experienced since before my transformation, before my flight from Terra, before the betrayal that had defined me: community, not family. I was too altered, too removed from humanity for that. But acceptance, recognition, a place where my existence was neither a secret to be hidden nor a weapon to be wielded, but simply a fact, another variation in the diverse tapestry they had woven. It could not last, of course. Nothing in this galaxy ever does. They came without warning, a strike force of the Inquisition's Ordo Xenos, accompanied by a full company of Deathwatch Space Marines. A fleet that materialized at the edge of the system and moved with terrible purpose toward Eric's Prime. Their mission was clear, their determination absolute. The abomination that was Concordia would be purged, its inhabitants put to the sword, its very existence expunged from imperial records. The colony had defenses, adaptations of technologies from multiple species combined in ways the Imperium could not anticipate. But they were not warriors, not primarily. They were builders, thinkers, creators. The battle was hopeless from the start. I fought alongside them, of course. What else could I do? I had stood against the Imperium for 10 millennia, had made opposition to its dogmas the core of my identity. I would not abandon these people who had welcomed me, who had shown me a vision of what could have been. The Deathwatch Marines were formidable opponents, their gene-enhanced bodies and superior equipment making them deadly combatants by any standard. But they were children compared to me. Their decades or even centuries of experience nothing against my millennia of warfare. With Osiris guiding my movements, enhancing my reaction times, analyzing their tactics, and predicting their responses, I cut through their ranks like a scythe through wheat. For a brief, glorious moment, I thought we might actually repel them. that Concordia might survive this assault as it had survived the harsh conditions of Eric's Prime for 2,000 years. Then the Inquisitor leading the assault played her final hand. She was a gaunt woman, her face a mask of scars and augmetic replacements, her eyes burning with fanaticism. And she wielded a weapon I had not seen since the Horus Heresy, a relic of the Dark Age that should have been impossible for even the Inquisition to possess: a null bomb, a device that, when detonated, would create a temporary zone of psychic nullification, severing all connection to the warp within its radius. For psychers, it meant agony and helplessness. For technology dependent on warp interfaces, which included much of the advanced tech that kept Concordia functioning, it meant failure at the worst possible moment. For me, it should have meant nothing. I was not a psyker. Osiris was not warp-dependent technology. But what I had not anticipated, what none of us had known, was that my own transformation had incorporated elements of the warp, subtle enhancements that Osiris had introduced over the centuries to improve my capabilities, enhancements I had not even been aware of. When the null bomb detonated, I felt as if I had been torn in half. Osiris' voice in my mind went silent. My enhanced reflexes, my augmented strength, my accelerated cognition all faltered. I was reduced to what I had been before my transformation, a dying thunder warrior, his body racked with the genetic degradation the Emperor had built into his kind. The pain was excruciating, a return of the agony I had thought long behind me. But worse was the silence in my mind, the absence of the companion who had been with me for 10,000 years. I called out to Osiris, both vocally and mentally, but there was no response. For the first time since that day in the Black Temple, I was alone. I fought on regardless, my skills and experience compensating somewhat for the loss of my enhancements, but I was outnumbered, weakened, and the colony around me was falling. The Xeno's defenders were slaughtered without mercy, the human collaborators captured for interrogation and inevitable execution. Concordia's buildings burned, its gardens were trampled, its libraries and data stores systematically destroyed. Another alternative to the Emperor's vision, erased. The Inquisitor herself came for me, accompanied by a squad of Deathwatch veterans. She knew what I was, had specifically included the null bomb in her arsenal to counter me. She had studied the suppressed records of the Thunder Legion, had tracked my movements across the millennia, had planned this moment with the methodical thoroughness that characterized the Inquisition at its most effective. "You are an abomination," she said as we faced each other in the burning ruins of what had been Concordia's central forum, a relic that should have been consigned to oblivion 10,000 years ago. "Your continued existence is an affront to the Emperor's design." I laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor, only the bitter recognition of history repeating itself. "The Emperor's design," I replied, my voice ragged with pain and fatigue, as if he foresaw any of this. As if this was what he intended when he set out to unify humanity. "Look around you, Inquisitor. Look at what the Imperium has become. A machine that exists only to perpetuate itself, grinding human lives into dust to fuel its endless wars. Is this what you serve? Is this worth the blood you spill?" For a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw doubt flicker in her augmetic eyes. A hesitation, a crack in the armor of her certainty. But it passed, replaced by the steel of conviction. "It is all that stands between humanity and extinction," she said. "All that preserves us from the horrors of the void and the predations of the warp. Your way, the way of compromise and coexistence, leads only to weakness, to vulnerability, to eventual destruction." The Emperor knew this. It is why he created the Imperium as he did. And there it was again, the fundamental premise that underlay everything. The belief that only through unity, only through conformity to a single vision, could humanity survive. The belief that had led to the betrayal of the Thunder Legion, to the destruction of alternative human civilizations during the Great Crusade, to the obliteration of Concordia, a belief I had spent 10,000 years opposing, yet had never truly escaped. For even in my rebellion, I had accepted its frame. I had defined myself against it, rather than beyond it. As the null bomb's effect began to fade, as I felt the first stirrings of Osiris returning to my consciousness, I made a decision. Not in that moment, but a continuation of a choice I had been making since I first fled Terra, since I first refused the death that had been programmed into my genes. I would not fight. Not this time. Not for a colony that was already lost. Not against warriors who were, in their own way, as much victims of the Imperium's dogma as I had been. Instead, I would survive. I would endure. I would continue to bear witness, to remember, to preserve the truth of what had been lost. With the last of my strength, with Osiris' help, I activated the teleport homer I had implanted in my armor, a failsafe I had maintained for millennia but rarely needed to use. As the Inquisitor's force weapon descended toward my head, I dissolved into a stream of particles, my consciousness held together by technologies so ancient they predated the Imperium itself. I rematerialized aboard my ship, which Osiris had kept in orbit, hidden from Imperial sensors by technologies we had acquired over the centuries. As my body reconstituted, the pain returned, worse than before, a sign that the null bomb's effects had done more damage than I had initially realized. Osiris' presence in my mind was fragmented, distorted, its usual clear voice reduced to garbled fragments of thought. We fled the Eric's system, pushing my small ship's engines beyond safe limits, escaping into the warp before the Imperial fleet could react to my departure. Only when we were safely in transit, only when I was certain we had escaped, did I allow myself to fully assess the damage. It was extensive. The null bomb had disrupted the delicate integration between my consciousness and Osiris, between the biological and technological components of my hybrid form. Systems that had functioned flawlessly for millennia were now degrading, failing in ways that even Osiris, damaged as it was, could not fully repair. I was dying, again, just as I had been in those days after the Emperor had betrayed the Thunder Legion, when my enhanced body had begun to fail according to the obsolescence built into my genes. History repeating itself, the circle closing. How long? I asked Osiris, the question forming with difficulty in my fractured thoughts. The response was delayed, uncertain, the once precise machine intelligence now struggling to perform calculations it had once executed instantaneously. Uncertain, it finally replied. Weeks, perhaps months, not years. So little time, after so many millennia. It seemed absurd, almost comical, to have survived for so long, through so much, only to fall now. Not even in glorious battle, but in slow decay, in systems failure, in the quiet dissolution of the technologies that had sustained me. And yet, there was a kind of symmetry to it. I had begun my long existence as a dying warrior, fleeing the fate the Emperor had designed for me. Perhaps it was fitting that I should end it the same way. But I was not the same being I had been then, not the desperate Thunder Warrior, running on instinct and rage. I had lived, I had witnessed. I had accumulated 10,000 years of memories, of knowledge, of understanding that no other being in the galaxy possessed. I had seen the birth of the Imperium, its golden age, its corruption, its long grinding decline. I had known the Emperor as he was, not as the god he had become in the myths of the ecclesiarchy. I could not let all of that die with me, could not let the truth be lost, the alternatives forgotten, the paths not taken erased from memory. There is a way, Osiris suggested, its thoughts becoming clearer as its systems slowly recovered from the null bomb's effect. But you will not like it. I knew immediately what it meant. There was only one technology in the galaxy that could preserve consciousness beyond the death of the body. Only one method of ensuring that memory would endure when flesh and machine alike had failed. Soul stones. The Eldar technology that captured the essence of their dead, preserving them from consumption by Slanesh. A technology I had encountered many times in my travels, had even studied with the help of a renegade harlequin during a period of wandering through the webway centuries ago, but I was not Eldar. My soul, if I still possessed such a thing after millennia of technological enhancement, was not attuned to their psychic matrix. The reborn process would be imperfect, unpredictable. I might preserve my consciousness, but lose my identity. Or worse, I might create something new, something that was neither the Thane Var who had rebelled against the Emperor, nor the hybrid being I had become with Osiris, but a third thing, a ghost in the system, a fragment of both. It is not ideal, Osiris acknowledged, but it is the only option that preserves anything of us, the only way to ensure that what we have witnessed is not lost. I considered alternatives, but found none that satisfied. My body was failing, my systems degrading beyond repair. Even if I could find another technological solution, another transformation like the one that had saved me in the Black Temple, there was no time to implement it before the damage became irreversible. And so I set course for a destination I had avoided for millennia, a place that represented everything I had rejected when I fled terror, when I chose existence over obedience. The one place in the galaxy where I might find the technology I needed, where I might preserve some echo of myself beyond my impending death. I went to Komorra, the dark city of the Drukhari, the fallen kin of the Eldar who had once guided me. There, among the most depraved beings in the galaxy, I would seek the means to extend my witness beyond the limits of my failing form, to ensure that someone, somewhere, would remember the truth of the Imperium's foundation, the betrayal that had started it all, the alternatives that had been erased, to ensure that someone would remember the Thunder Legion and the first Space Marine to betray the Emperor.